Before I begin, I would like to take the time to give a shout out to streamer and my longtime friend, Cyra D Redspear, for helping me make this video. Cyra is a VTuber who's also a snow leopard and specializes in streaming dungeon crawlers, JRPGs, and shmups, especially shmups since her personal knowledge of the genre was huge in helping me make this video. She's a budding streamer who only just started out in December, so new followers do help. Outside of that, she writes and practices both Hongar Gong Fu and the banjo. She's also a DJ and shares FM synth music every Friday and awesome indie hardcore jungle drum and bass every Sunday. But most of all, Cyra has been one of my oldest online friends. She was the one who encouraged me to embrace my queer furry side, literally made me into the possum you see before you today. And from the lessons she taught me, it's why I also call upon you to respect Asian Americans and Filipino people, to advocate for the rights of AAPI people and trans people, to remind you that Black Lives Matter, to research and respect pre-colonial Filipino culture and anti-colonial literature. And for the love of God, stop making Nutshack jokes, they were never funny. If you want to help her out after all she's done for me and this channel, please follow and subscribe to her Twitch channel at twitch.tv/fmsynth, or click on the link in the description below. You can also join her server where she talks about martial arts and hosts movie nights on Saturdays. Also, you can subscribe to her Twitter and her co-host accounts. Those links are also in the description below. You'll be helping her out a ton by joining all the fun. Once again, that's twitch.tv/fmsynth, or click on the links in the description below. And now, on to our show.
And now, our feature presentation.
Today's story begins with the Jukebox. While prototypes had existed since 1889 as coin-operated phonographs, it was not until 1928 when player piano manufacturer Justus P. Seeberg combined an electrostatic loudspeaker with a coin-operated record player that the modern idea of the jukebox came into the world. Using 8 and later 10 separate turntables, patrons could select from the available records which songs they wanted to play in the establishment of their choice, all for the price of a nickel. By the 1940s, companies like Rockola and Wurlitzer were manufacturing the iconic models of jukebox that we know today, although they did not like using that term as it was slang derived from the familiar usage juke joint, i.e. an informal nightclub primarily operated by African Americans. Juke manufacturers did not want their fine products to be associated with such disreputable places, also because they were racist. By the time World War II ended and America was entering a period of post-war prosperity, the jukebox industry was still in demand but had lost some much-needed ground. The growth of portable radios and vinyl records becoming more affordable meant that they became less of a necessity. Faced with a shrinking market at home, the jukebox business focused their efforts in identifying an overseas market that would have more demand. They found it in former World War II opponent, Japan. The war having devastated the economy and left the public with very little disposable income, the jukebox companies imported their wares to Japanese companies who had signed distribution rights. In spite of import costs causing them to be more expensive than US prices, the jukebox business in Japan was one of the first to really explode in their post-war Reconstruction era. It wasn't before long before these distributors started to construct and distribute their own jukeboxes. One of them, Nihon Goraku Busan, used their status as the largest distributor of jukeboxes to also create pinball machines and other coin-operated amusements, which they would do under the name Sega. There were also smaller companies getting into this business. One of them was founded in 1969 by Kagemasa Kozuki, or Kaz Kozuki as he was also known. His business was a jukebox rental/repair business based out of Osaka. By March 19, 1973, he had fully incorporated it under the name Konami Industry Company Ltd, or just simply Konami. As the 70s went on, they started to expand into areas of other coin-operated amusements. By the dawn of the 80s, Konami were one of the fastest growing video game companies in Japan. The video game world would not be where it is today without Konami. Formerly one of the most reliable names in video games, Konami spent 3 decades developing and launching some of gaming's most beloved franchises: Contra, Castlevania, Mystical Ninja, Suikoden, countless licensed beat-em-up games, equally countless rhythm games under their Beimani division, the Silent Hill series, the Metal Gear series, the list goes on. And that's not even getting into the talented developers who made those franchises. People like Masato Maegawa, Koji Igarashi, Keiichiro Toyama, and the Mad Master himself, Hideo Kojima. Saying all this compounds the tragedy that the Konami we all knew and loved has been dead for almost a decade. What we now have is just a name that only exists to pump out Yu-Gi-Oh cards, pachinko machines, and workers' rights abuses. The Konami of 2023 is a slumbering, decrepit dragon lying on its hoard of franchises that it will only occasionally re-release either in the most bare-bones way or be given to hack survival horror devs to ruin. I'm not editorializing, you are! But we can always remember the good times. Specifically, the time in the 80s. Konami was still a growing studio, not yet the complete corporate behemoth it would become. But by then, it was big enough to want to branch out into other areas to help its primary business of the time. And what business happened to be big in the late 80s? Why, direct-to-video, of course. Which is how we got today's subject.
KYOTO ビデオ
Long ago, in a galaxy far, far away, the pristine water planet Latis enjoys a peaceful existence being ruled over by its benevolent prince, soon to be king, Lord British. Apparently, there were a lot more Ultima fans at Konami than we previously thought. One day, after returning from a diplomatic mission, Lord British oversees a strange archaeological discovery, a Moai statue made of smooth black stone with strange lettering etched into it. It details an ancient prophecy.
1000年の彼方より炎の海に生まれ住む巨大な竜が目覚めしとき狂気のフォースが迫りきて天地は闇に飲み込まれやがて光は打ち砕ける
Lord British's high priest and silly hat connoisseur Doramu begs His Majesty to heed this foreboding warning. But Lord British's skepticism gets the better of him, and he orders the statue's removal. During that process, however, that statue teleports into space, shatters in half, and takes out a nearby spacecraft.
Is that a good siren?
No, Mr. Simpson, it is a bad siren. Shortly afterwards, the sky begins to darken, the seas begin to rise, and the ground begins to quake. The fire planet Salamander is alight with dark energy from a dragon born within its depths, and the mysterious, unseen cosmic force known as Bacterian is now beginning the invasion stage of sending monstrous bioweapons to conquer Latis and consume it into its ever-growing forces. After sending wave after wave of his own soldiers to a fiery death, Lord British is now faced with a difficult situation. If he wants to save Latis and not be the cause of its doom, he has to swallow his pride and contact the planet Gradius for help. For Gradius has 3 pilots that fought in one against Bacterian and lived to tell the tale: Dan, Stephanie, and Eddie. If Lord British wishes to save his nation, he'll have to forge an ironclad alliance with these young, world-weary soldiers who each have their own story to tell. By the end of it all, he'll be there to trade his cushy throne for a pilot seat and beat back the forces of Bacterian before Salamander consumes his homeworld. When Konami stepped into the OVA scene, of course one of the projects they were going to greenlit was an adaptation of one of their video games. And not just any video game, but their most successful franchise up to that point: the Gradius franchise. This is one of those projects that, even if you don't know the exact details of what went on behind the scenes, you could feel the powers that be wanting this to be a massive success. But Konami's time in the animation production sphere was quite brief. Aside from this and the hyper-experimental previous episode subject Take the X Train, Konami never put forth more money towards OVA production after 1989. And as I said before in that Take the X Train video, it does feel like Konami has been trying to bury this part of their history with how little preservation they've committed to it. The most recent official release of the Salamander OVA was from a 1995 sub-only VHS release in the UK from the forgotten 90s European distributor Western Connection. In brief, I ascertained that Konami wanted Salamander to be a breakout hit to capitalize on their bread-and-butter arcade games, and when sales didn't live up to their expectations, they washed their hands of the whole venture. But if it really did fail, why though? Was it because the OVA market was beginning to recede by the end of the 80s? Or was the OVA trilogy meant to expand the story of Salamander and Gradius, simply not a story that needed to be told? Hop into the Vic Viper, because we're going to get to the core of Salamander and see if it does need to be destroyed.
Destroy them all!
Tracing their development all the way back to the Target Sports of old, shooting gallery games have always been a mainstay at amusement arcades and boardwalks. With the growth of technology, those games would evolve into some of the first video games. Arguably, the first of the type was the early mainframe game Space War. Developed by MIT student Stephen Russell in 1962 as just a fun little project between bored computer scientists, it presents a dogfight between two spacecraft, the Needle and the Wedge. The little programming exercise would end up being the root by which tons of early space combat games would blossom from. One of these games was 1978's Space Invaders. Created by Tomohiro Nishikado of Japan's Taito, the idea behind the game was to take the template spearheaded by Breakout and refit it into a space shooting gallery game to capitalize on the sci-fi boom that Japan was going through at the time, thanks to properties such as Captain Harlock and Star Wars. It was a colossal hit, not just commercially, but in terms of legacy. It inspired throngs of young soon-to-be developers ranging from Shigeru Miyamoto to John Romero, and on top of that, it led to an explosion of similar games being greenlit and released, creating the genre we now know as shoot-'em-ups, or Shmups for short. But the best part about this explosion is that developers knew they couldn't just rip off Space Invaders wholesale. If they wanted to get people's attention and their quarters, they would have to constantly innovate this new emerging genre. Atari's Asteroids had multi-directional shooting, SNK's Ultima Wars introduced vertical scrolling and hit points, Namco's Galaxian had colored graphics and individualized antagonists, and Nintendo's Radar Scope added a three-dimensional perspective. But one of the bigger innovations came from Konami, with the release of their arcade game Scramble in 1981. Its big innovation was that it exchanged the vertical scrolling style with a horizontal side-scrolling one. This was similar to another shoot-'em-up that came out around the same time, Williams Electronics Defender. But whereas Defender scrolled in both directions on a wraparound screen, Scramble scrolled in a singular direction, with the goal not just being taking out enemies, but avoiding terrain and maintaining a limited fuel supply. It was also the first shoot-'em-up to have multiple distinct levels, giving players the feeling of going on multiple missions rather than being caught in an endless space battle that only ends when your ship blows up. Scramble was Konami's most successful game up to that point, topping arcade charts that year in both Japan and the United States. In a 1990 interview with Replay magazine, Kaz Kozuki went on record in saying that Scramble was Konami's most important game as it launched the company into world prominence. Fast forward to 1984. Konami had produced several classic arcade games in those 3 years, and they were ready to transition from being a mere electronic amusements producer to a full-time games development studio. The brass wanted to produce a game that took them to the next level, so they assigned game designer and programmer Hiroyasu Machiguchi a small team to come up with their next big arcade game. Almost immediately, they decided on a shoot-'em-up as a few years ago, Namco's Xevious had completely raised the bar on the genre by convincingly portraying lush organic landscapes in lieu of the space levels that had been used prior thanks to tech limitations. Machiguchi and company wanted to see if they could make a game that surpassed that. What they had in mind in the beginning was a sequel to Scramble, and indeed the game had been called Scramble 2 early in development. For this project, the team was given a year-long time frame which allowed them to experiment, and they were also utilizing Konami's new 16-bit bubble system, which gave them plenty of hardware capacity and memory to use at their disposal. But even then, there was still pressure felt by Machiguchi's team to deliver. As it was our first title, we didn't have any confidence about what we were doing. We had a lot of anxiety. In any event, we started coming up with things and we tested out idea after idea on the monitor screens. For example, with the options, we must have tried out around 20 different movement patterns for them, proceeding by process of elimination when something didn't work. The development period for Gradius took about a year, and all the while it was a process of continual experimentation and refinement. Released in Japanese arcades in early 1985 and American arcades later that year under the name Nemesis, Gradius was instantly a hit. It topped the Japanese arcade game charts that summer, and in Europe, it was the highest grossing arcade game of the entire year. The thing about Gradius, in comparison to later horizontal shmups like Darius or shmups in general, is that the main gameplay involving powering up the Vic Viper, or other ships in the case of Gradius Gaiden, is that you, the player, are always in control of how powered up you should make the ship. You're in control of how fast you should make yourself. You're in control of what shield you use, and how many option pods will follow you around and shoot whatever bullets, lasers, and missiles you also choose within your own layout before beginning your mission. Other horizontal shooting games down the line like Darius Gaiden or R-Type are more controlled in what the game wants to offer you in terms of power-ups. These pickups are dropped by enemies in a specific order to shields, shot power-ups, and more, which have their own merits and types of balances in accordance to how fast or slow each stage scrolls by and progresses. I definitely think, then, that the level of control and rank within the Gradius series is unprecedented and requires a higher understanding of its skill ceiling in order to truly master how to pilot the Vic Viper. To follow up the success of Gradius, Machiguchi and his team developed a spin-off called Salamander, which not only introduced co-op mode via Vic Viper's ally ship Lord British, but also scores of new mechanics. In Salamander's case, the game does tell you which pickups to choose from in its crunchy digitized voice. Multiple. And you can still control how many speed pickups you can choose. I opt for just one. Along with how many options you get, they're called multiple, in this one. And whether or not you want a main bullet, ripple laser, or straight laser by stage 2's vertical section. The game does a wonderful job in training you, the player, in both aspects of play and spatial conditioning, switching between both methods every stage onwards. But by that point, Konami was feeling the squeeze of the competition catching up with them. This caused them to immediately start production on Gradius 2, Gopher no Yabo, or Gopher's Ambition, a sequel that planned on taking the strategizing of the first game and its spin-off to a whole new level. In the case of Gradius 2, Gopher no Yabo for instance, the game's rank system, or dynamic difficulty, this is also exemplified in other games like Battle Gaiga and Mecha Ritz Steel Rondo, is determined how many option pods you decide to have trailing behind you. The game becomes progressively harder. More bullets and enemies spawn against Vic Viper to make sure your vulnerable tiny ship in the ever-expanding cosmos will die in the cold vacuum of space, alone with no one else to hear you scream. The game even sends its own anti-option enemy against you, a small Bacterian enemy called the Option Hunter, or in Salamander's case, the Option Eater. Something that will eat your options pod and will try to kill you while also being invulnerable itself. The main strategy then is not to get the full 4 option pods and vie for at least just 2 pods to trail you in order to mitigate difficulty, only going back to full 4 in safer stages later into the game. Konami, however, probably wasn't gonna rely on just an awesome new game with awesome new mechanics to fill their coffers. This is all baseless theory I have from here on out, but with Gradius 2 just starting development at the time, it could be inferred Konami wanted to really hedge their bets in making the Gradius franchise feel even bigger. A franchise whose reach went beyond the arcade, which might just be how the idea for an OVA trilogy based off of Gradius, its spin-off, and its soon-to-be sequel came into being. We don't know the specifics as to why Konami entered the OVA sphere, but I would have to guess that it was to make the Salamander OVA. Another theory I have as to why they first put their money behind something so uncommercial like Take the X Train was because they saw it as a trial run to show that they could become producers. And if it did lose money, they could easily make it up with the release of a guaranteed moneymaker like a Gradius OVA trilogy. So, teaming up with publishing company Pony Canyon, Konami's big Salamander OVA project began in earnest. The studio they enlisted in this project would be celebrated 80s anime workhorse Pierrot, but more specifically, it would be a project steered by director Hisayuki Toriumi, an almost too perfect choice for a director. After all, Toriumi directed the anime that made the OVA format in the first place, Dalos, and had also great success directing an exceptional OVA adaptation of the famed dogfighting manga Area 88. On top of all that, he was directing the sci-fi horror anime film Lilycat around that same time as Salamander. Konami scored big with getting someone to adapt an anime with lots of space aircraft battles and horrors from beyond the stars. How did it all turn out then? The Area 88 comparison is apt because a lot of what I see in Salamander feels like an extension of that anime, especially on the animation side of things. It didn't have the budget of Area 88 though. A lot of the environments feel undetailed, some shots of characters feel stiff and awkward. There are almost zero extras in this movie, which makes a lot of the human cost of the Bacterian's devastation of Ladas be something that's told to us rather than shown. And some of Toriumi's boarding, most of which is fantastic, is also obviously there to reduce the need for lip movements. However, like any good mid-budget OVA of this time period, it puts the money where it needs to go. Animation director Toshiyasu Okada and his team are 100% dedicated in doing their best to translating the action from the arcades to your TV screen at home. Vic Viper and Lord British, the ship, are designed real slick thanks to Yasuhiro Moriiki's work as a mechanical designer. The Bacterian look and feel like creatures from beyond the veil. Seeing them up close and personal gives you a real sense of how alien they are and how Space Aces fighting an ever shape-shifting enemy seems to be no small task. This really gets to be shown off in the third OVA, seeing the titular Gopher of Gopher's Ambition, a disgusting pile of flesh that, even when obscured by shadows, feels like something you don't want to look at for too long. And just like Area 88, some of the trilogy's best animation comes from the aerial battles, or space battles in this case. Okada's animators knew that you were here to watch some awesome space dogfights, and they deliver. You see Vic Vipers weave and roll through the expanse of space, firing off lasers and shooting down enemy fighters, flying out of docking bays and buzzing the undersides of dreadnoughts, taking out monster space dragons by absolutely shredding them to pieces. And that's not even getting into the best part of the visuals, the effects animation. It's the one constant throughout this trilogy. All of the effects animation puts the stellar in interstellar combat. You kinda need to, considering how much fire and solar flares are in this trilogy. They almost seem like brushstrokes with how they dance across the Bible Black emptiness, burning unthinkable amounts of heat to create planetary hellscapes. These techniques aren't even limited to fire and laser effects. They can also be used to show off the oozy, organic fleshiness of what happens when the Bacterian sets up shop on a formerly inorganic moon, or how Salamander's very presence creates some amazing tidal waves and earthquakes to rain down destruction on Ladas. It's all there to show us that the enemies you are fighting in the Gradius games aren't just faceless mobs, but beings that need to be destroyed at all costs for your planet's survival. What I really noticed though was that as the trilogy progresses, it always seemed to get better in terms of visual design. OVA 3 in particular is where they are bringing out the big guns in terms of artistry and direction, especially with how art director Kayoko Kodabashi can make some of the scenes look downright psychedelic. And since this is an animated adaptation, there is going to be some fan service. And I mean in the traditional sense, get your minds out of the gutter. City pop producer Tatsushi Umegaki is brought in to bring the memorable melodies of all three games and turn them into driving space opera battle music. Some scenes are blocked in a way that seeks to emulate the side-scrolling nature of the games itself. The credit sequence of OVA 2 shows an artistic rendering of the entire first level from the first game, and this would not be a true Gradius tie-in without the presence of Moai. Visually, I think Salamander has everything you could want out of an anime adaptation of the Gradius games. But still, can it also have a good story? Like most arcade games of this time period, the plot of Salamander, and by extension the other Gradius games, were all rudimentary and tucked away onto one page of an instruction manual, only there to give whatever's happening on screen the barest sense of context. It all raises the question of how Do you even adapt the story of the Gradius games, a franchise where the most recognizable character is the spaceship you control? In crafting the story for this trilogy, I feel like Toriumi takes a couple of pages for what he did for Dalos and Area 88. That is, making the trilogy a character-driven drama that just so happens to center around space warfare against cosmic horrors. The main plot of the first OVA isn't just Lotus military trying to fight off Salamander and Bacterian, but also Lord British learning how to be a more effective ruler and getting his head out of his ass. At the start of the anime, he's stubborn, dismissive, and, worst of all, has boring taste in women.
いくら有力な王族だからといって耳の尖った娘や尻尾の生えた姫君を迎えるわけにはいくまい
But after that whole dark prophecy coming true thing, British is forced to admit that maybe his high priest in the funny hat was, in fact, completely right. But even then, contacting assistance from Gradius is presented as a last resort. Not just because of Lord British's pride, but also because, in the background, Lotus and Gradius don't exactly have the best relationship.
亡き父親もなぜかグラディウスを嫌っておったその件に関してはその方たちが詳しかろう
過ぎ去った昔の不幸でございます。今はそれを持ち出しておる場合ではございません。
And I love the way the pilots are introduced. They are given so much build up with them flying to Lotus in complete silence, and when they arrive in the throne room, they are cast completely in shadows that slowly fade to reveal them as the scene goes on, showing off that these guys and girl are the real deal. But Lord British doesn't trust them. Don might be on the level, what with him being the leader, but Stephanie is a hardened soldier of war who is not afraid to give Mr. Royalty Pantaloons the business.
あなたはそれでも王子なのですか私たちの忠告に耳を貸す配慮はないのですか殴られたことがないから痛みを知らないのよ最前線にいる兵士たちの苦しみを何とも思わないのよ
And Eddie is in exile from Lotus thanks to some unsavory business his father did years back, and you know, sins of the father and all.
この屋敷の主が陰謀を企てたのが発覚して罪は一族に及んだそう聞いておる
よほど憎まれたんだなただねこれを見ていたらなんというのか追放された一族の中には何も知らずにこれで遊んでいた子供もいたのかと
It's this friction that adds texture to the final battle where British and the Gradius pilots find common ground and are able to complete the mission successfully working as a team. It also reaches an emotional climax with Eddie sacrificing himself just so the others can get away.
間違えちゃ困る俺は親父のために親父の故郷のために
I've actually seen some complaints about the order that the OVAs are presented in. Starts with Salamander, then goes into a prequel with Gradius, before finally ending with Gradius 2. But let me assure you, this is a deliberate choice because OVA 2 is not just there to tell you the story of Gradius, but also to add context to the character's actions in Salamander. OVA 2's main plot lines are the disappearance of Gradius' president, who is also Stephanie's father, and the mysterious demise of a ship full of nomads, with the only survivor being a mysterious girl named Paula. These two events are, of course, both connected to the Bacterians' invasion. Stephanie's father, who has been communicating with her telepathically throughout the OVA, turns out to be a cyber brain that she ends up having to destroy to win the battle, explaining her hardened attitude and devotion to destroying Bacterian in the first OVA.
違うわお父様グラディウスを救ったのはお父様よサイバーブレインに改造されてもなお人間としての心を失わなかった強い精神力よ
Eddie, meanwhile, has felt drawn towards Paula because she is of a nomadic race that is discriminated against, and he is a Lotus exile on Gradius where he has also faced discrimination. And when she reveals herself to be a Bacterian spy tricking Eddie into revealing one of Gradius' weaknesses, he manages to fend her off but still gives a heartbreaking speech about why he's not happy about it.
グラディウスの人間ではないいい化けはグラディウス政府に拾われた亡命貴族なんだよ
Adds a little something to his sacrifice back in the previous OVA. But it's the final volume where I think all the characters come together and have their strongest moments. It starts off with Gradius and Lotus signing a long-awaited peace treaty, and focuses entirely on Don and Lord British fighting alongside each other to rescue Stephanie from the clutches of a returning Paula who wants her to become Gopher Cyberbrain against her will. I was a little wary of this plot since it did feel like we were in for a good old-fashioned Gundam Seed style damselification of the badass female lead. After all, Stephanie spends half the OVA's runtime in a voluminous pink ball gown tied up in the villain's lair. And the reason why Lord British is so determined to rescue her is so he can propose marriage to her.
思い出しますわ、今でも。
ああ、彼は本当の勇者であった。我がラピスではイーヴァン家の名誉復活を。
何言ってんだ。早いとこ本音を告白してやれ。
But once Don and Lord British rescue her, she rips that gown off and goes back to being the hard ass she is. And even better, she takes up the role of the voice pinpointing the weaknesses of the enemies just like in the arcade game.
目を狙い撃ちして。
And is the one who takes control of Lord British's ship to fight alongside Don to take out the merged form of Paula and Gopher. And the whole subplot of Lord British trying to work up the courage to propose, he gives it up at the end because he knows she's better off as a soldier rather than royalty fighting alongside her comrade in arms Don. That is the best way to wrap up a frankly one-sided romantic relationship in an anime that probably didn't need one in the first place.
君たちは本当に息が合っている。互いの心を理解し合っている。羨ましい限りであった。
So there you have it. The Salamander trilogy of OVAs works as both visual spectacles and character-driven space operas. The question remains though, why don't more people remember this anime? We don't have access to the hard sales data about Salamander like we do with the game, so it's hard to tell if it was indeed a flop. But you have to imagine Konami was not happy with the final sales numbers. After the final OVA was released to promote Gradius 2 and to prime the pump for Gradius 3 being released that year, they exited the OVA game altogether. And to reiterate, with 0 re-releases since the 90s, you get the feeling that they kinda want to forget this OVA even happened, like it was their whole history as a game studio. But if Salamander was a commercial flop, why was it a commercial flop? Well, this might be a bitter pill to swallow, but I think the problem might be with Gradius' audience. I'm not really a part of the shmup scene, so I cannot really speak for it when it comes to the appeal of the genre, but I do know someone who is.
When I'm playing a shoot 'em up, I'm free to move wherever I want. So, like a new type, I can move freely in space. I'm only limited by the boundaries inside the game. And in any other kind of video game, I've never felt this amount of freedom. And that's why I like shoot 'em ups that much. I connect with them on a level that I can't express otherwise.
Those are all great reasons for why people love to play shmups. You will notice that none of those reasons were the story. This is not an indictment on shmups fans for being Philistines who can't appreciate games as a storytelling medium. I'm not being a pretentious asshole here. What I am saying is that story is of little concern to the shmups crowd. It's nice that it's there, but if it doesn't make the ship move more smoothly or give you power-ups faster, then you really don't have to pay attention to it. In the late 80s, the people playing games like Gradius or Salamander didn't need to know who was piloting Vic Viper. They were more concerned about using Vic Viper to beat the game while netting a high score to get them on the board. It was an old school arcade game. A Gradius anime to them might have been another feather in their cap as fans, but it wasn't an absolute necessity. Plus, all that money that would have been spent on a singular VHS could have gone to more Gradius 2 games, and that's an easy choice to make if you're an arcade freak. If Salamander was a commercial disappointment by Konami standards, the anime can at least take solace that it was not its fault. It's just that the target audience had a different hierarchy of needs. The legacy of Gradius and its spin-offs and its sequels lives on through those games and the future shmups they helped inspire like Eschatos, Esperad, and Alesta Collection. In that vast history, the Salamander OVA feels like a footnote. But it doesn't need to be. I repeat, it's exactly as good as an anime adaptation of a shmups game needs to be. Quality space battles, an obvious interest in the source material, and some compelling character drama to knit it all together. I might not be the shmups expert in this video, but I am the anime expert. And I do say that the Salamander anime is well worth your time. It is still a shame Konami never did go back to make another anime like this again. That means we'll never know what a Parodius anime would have looked like. Oh well, not the last time they'll disappoint me.